heads down. Keep your heads down.
Pipe down, I'm on the radio.
The We Have Ways Festival Special Series, here on History of Jackson. Right, so hello and welcome back to the History with Jackson podcast for our We Have Ways Festival Special Series. And today we're joined by Philippe Sands. How you doing, mate?
I'm doing really well, and I'm really excited to go to my first ever We Have Ways festival. I've done the podcast a few times, and I've always loved it, and I love the audience and love the feedback, but I'm very excited to be there in person.
Well, it's one of the most awesome festivals. You're really going to love it. It's brilliant, and the food's awesome. So
food is very important, very important.
Well, today we're talking about 38 Londres Street, on Impunity, Pinochet in England, and a Nazi in Patagonia. And I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write this book and tell this story?
Well, many years ago in 1998, a man called Augusto Pinochet, who seized power in Chile by a coup d'etat, military coup d'etat, on September the 11th, 1973, and stayed in power until 1990. And over those 17 years, thousands of people were disappeared, tens of thousands were tortured, and even more detained, and many killed. He arrives in London for medical treatment in October 1998, and to his great surprise and horror, he is arrested. And in the legal proceedings that follow, I am one of the barristers who gets involved in the case. So that was really my first introduction to this character, Augusto Pinochet, who I'd heard of but didn't know much about. Anyway, park that thought, and about 16 or 17 years pass, and I'm in Austria, in a tiny village called Hagenberg, when I am in the archive of a man called Horst Wächter, who is the son of the main character in a book I wrote called The Rat Line, about Nazis who escaped to South America. And Horst Wächter's given me access to his mum and dad's 10,000 pages of archives. And I'm poring through the archives, and I come across a letter sent in 1949 in May from Damascus in Syria to Otto Wächter, an Austrian Nazi on the run who's holed up in the Vatican, wondering where he should go to escape prosecution. And the letter writer in Damascus, Syria, says to him, don't come to the Arab world. It's not a good place. Head to South America. Wächter, for readers of the Rat Line will know, dies a few weeks later in mysterious circumstances. But I got interested in who wrote the letter. And the letter was written by a man called Walter Rauff. I Googled Rauff. I thought I didn't know the name. In fact, it turns out I had come across him. And Walter Rauff was an SS man working with Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, who in 1941 and 1942 was charged with operating a fleet of mobile gas vans that would go around Nazi-occupied Europe, gassing groups of about 50 Jews and Poles and Roma to their deaths. And this was the letter writer. So I thought, that's an interesting connection between Rauff and Wächter, and I checked out what became of Rauff. And to cut to the chase, I discovered that Rauff ended up living in Chile. He moved in 1958 to Chile and became the manager of a king crab cannery in the town of Punta Arenas in the south. And while I was doing the research, I started noticing rumours that Rauff may have worked with Augusto Pinochet after Augusto Pinochet took power. And so at that point I became intrigued. Could it be that Walter Rauff, Nazi on the run, worked with Augusto Pinochet, in whose case I was involved in London in 1998? And that was the point at which I decided I would explore the relationship between these two men. So it's about...
I think it's always really interesting where there's an intersection between a personal experience and some of the research you're doing, especially seeing the kind of parallels between Ralph's story and Pinochet's story. And at the centre, there's the concept of extradition. So why is extradition so important in the case of Pinochet?
I'll come to the question of Pinochet in a minute, but what I was amazed about as I started researching about Ralph was I learned that 5 years after he arrived in Chile, he's living in a small apartment in Punta Arenas. There's a knock on the door. It's the police. He's under arrest. He's wanted for genocide and crimes against humanity, to be extradited to West Germany to be put on trial for the murder of hundreds of thousands of people using these gas fans. So he's carted off to Santiago, the capital of Chile, and there a trial is held to determine whether he can be sent to West Germany to face charges for what he had done 22 years earlier. The Chilean Supreme Court, in its wisdom, rules that he cannot be sent to West Germany because the crimes he is alleged to have been involved in, mass murder, gassing to death hundreds of thousands of people, took place too long ago. Chile has what's called a limitations period, which is someone cannot be tried or extradited to another country if the crime happened more than 15 years previously. And in this case, it was 22 years. And so the court says you can't be extradited. So he goes back to Punta Arenas, resumes his life running the King Crab Cannery. And what was astonishing was I then learned that the lawyers who worked on Ralph's case in 1963, one of them at least, was the lawyer that I sat next to in the House of Lords on the argument as to whether Pinochet could be extradited to Spain. So what happened in Pinochet's case is that a Spanish judge, on the theory of something called universal jurisdiction, some crimes are so terrible that any country in the world has the competence to try those cases, issued proceedings in Spain to arrest and prosecute Augusto Pinochet for the crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, the mass murder of Chileans and a few other nationals. That becomes important. We may come back to that later. And the judge is called Balthazar Garzon. He sends a request for extradition to Scotland Yard in London. Scotland Yard then goes to a magistrate, a man called Nicholas Evans, who happens to be my next door neighbour, who signs a warrant for the arrest of Augusto Pinochet on the evening of the 16th of October 1998. Pinochet is then arrested, put under detention, and the first thing he says is, look, all of these acts you're complaining about, I did whilst I was president of Chile. And so under international law and under English law, I have absolute immunity in relation to any acts that I did as president. And so the case then goes to the English courts. Does Pinochet have a right to claim immunity from the jurisdiction of the English courts? If he can claim immunity, he can't be sent to Spain and he'll go back to Chile. If he doesn't have immunity, he can be sent to Spain to face trial for the charges that Judge Garzon has brought against him. And so the proceedings in Britain in October, November 1998 were huge. They determined for the first time in human history the question, can the courts of one country try a person, a former president who has committed crimes in another country, his own country, or does he have immunity from those charges? And the House of Lords famously ruled, first in November 1998 and then in March 1999, that Augusto Pinochet did not have absolute immunity. And in particular, there were a series of acts of torture in which he was said to be involved, for which he could not claim immunity and for which he could be sent to Spain. So that this was a revolutionary moment. It was the first time ever that the national courts of one country had said that a former head of state had no immunity. It had happened before with international courts, the famous Nuremberg Tribunal 1945 and the Tokyo Tribunal 1946, but it had never happened before a national court. And so this was a historic moment.
And what was Pinochet's reaction to?
Well, as you'll know, because you've read the book, I have tracked down most of the people who were most directly involved. And I think it's fair to say that my favourite character in the entire book, and there are many characters, is a lady called Jean Pateras. Jean Pateras is a dual national, Chilean-British. She's an interpreter. And she had been an interpreter for Scotland Yard for many years. So when Scotland Yard learned that they were going to have to arrest Augusto Pinochet, and that he didn't speak any English, they thought we need an interpreter. So they call up Jean, and this is the story that she tells me. She's a remarkable person. She gets the call, they don't tell her who it is. Then eventually, when she's at Scotland Yard, she finds out who it is. She's pretty surprised. And she toddles off to the London Clinic on Devonshire Place, room 801, on the 8th floor, where Pinochet is recovering from a minor back operation. And I describe it in the book, and, she goes into some detail about it, that they go up the elevator, they arrive, there's a couple of Chileans who won't refuse to let her in with the Scotland Yard folks. The police say, well, if you don't let us in, we'll arrest you, so they let them in. They go in, she's in the room, Pinochet's in bed in his pyjamas, he's been woken up so that he's sort of, conscious of what's going on. And as Jean says, I told him what was happening. I told him he was under arrest for crimes against humanity and genocide and murder. And I just said to Jean, how did he react? What's his reaction to all of this? And she said, he looked at me and he just said, I know the fucker who's behind this. And he identified a Spanish lawyer called Juan Garces, remarkable person who had been an aide to the deposed Chilean president Salvador Allende. And Pinochet was right about that. Anyway, the thing about Jean is that she then stays on the case for all of the time that Pinochet's in London. So anytime Scotland Yard have any interactions with Pinochet, which is very regularly and very often, Jean goes along to interpret. And so she's with him at the moment the House of Lords rules that he has lost his claim to immunity. And I said, well, how did he react to that? And she said, well, he was eating his favourite cake, dulce de leche. They had all the suitcases piled up, Harrods bags, ready to fly off back to Chile. And when he heard the judgment, he wept. And it's these tiny little human points of detail that I think that make a book that deals with historical and legal issues of great significance, I think actually really interesting. My favourite anecdote, in fact, was after Pinochet was arrested, Jean was very, very excited. She couldn't ring her mum straight away, who was, I think, back in Chile somewhere, because it was just too late. It was midnight. So she waited till the next day, and she calls her mum. I'm imitating her voice, and she says, Mummy, 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 you're not going to believe what happened to me yesterday. And her mother's already cottoned on to what's happened in London, and she says, don't tell me you've been involved in the arrest of that wonderful man who saved us from all the communists. And it's these human interactions, I think, with a big story and a nasty story that I think bring things to life. So he showed his emotions.
I think that human side of the book, it does, like you said, it brings them to life in a way where it's not just big events and murder without a reaction. It does place you in it so you can kind of understand what's going on. Now, you said that Pinochet was being arrested for genocide and torture. What kind of events were going off? How was he initiating that? And then, if you have a former Nazi officer who was involved in the Holocaust within your country, was Pinochet leading on Ralph for this?
Maybe the best way for me to answer that question is to take you to 38 Londres Street. It's an actual place. Londres means London in Spanish or in French. And it's a beautiful street right in the centre of Santiago, less than a kilometre from the presidential palace. Until September 1973, it was the headquarters of the Socialist Party. Small, two-storey building, old, cobbled, a beautiful street. Pinochet then takes over the building immediately, appropriates it, and turns it into a detention centre and then into an interrogation centre, and then into a torture centre. And in researching the book, I come across a man called Leon Gomez. He's 18 years old in 1973. He is detained by the Pinochet secret police, the DINA, the Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, and he is carted off to 38 Londres Street. He's taken there in a refrigerated van, which he mentions to me, the significance of which I did not know when he first mentioned it to me. He's with about 20 other people. He's offloaded from the van. They go inside the building. He recognizes the building from the tiles on the floor. He's then taken to an upstairs room. He's undressed. He's tied to the old metal frame of a bed, and he is tortured with electricity. And in the course of the next days, he recognizes a German accent with a voice of someone who is issuing instructions to those who are torturing. An older man in a suit sitting behind a typewriter, and he says that he recognized the man straight away, Walter Ralph. And he recognized him because as a little boy, 10 years earlier, he remembered the photographs in all the Chilean newspapers when Ralph was arrested in Punta Arenas and taken up to Santiago for those proceedings that we were talking about before to extradite him to West Germany. He recognized the man. And what happened at 38 Londres Street to Leon Gomez was emblematic of what happened across Chile. Leon Gomez was taken to 38 Londres Street with 6 other colleagues. The other 6 disappeared and were never seen again. And to this day, there are at least 1,300 or more people whose disappearances have never been explained. Many were burned in incinerators. Some were taken up into helicopters and from a great height dumped into the ocean, obviously never seen again. Some were taken on boats from ports like San Antonio and their corpses deposited at sea. And essentially what happened at 38 Londres Street and these kinds of stories, detention, interrogation, torture, killing or disappearance, happened to thousands and thousands of people. And Pinochet was said to be behind the whole thing. He had always said it was others. He issued general orders to deal with a problem. He never issued specific instructions to torture, to disappear, to kill or anything. That has proven, of course, to be untrue. He was deeply, deeply involved. But it was a, regime that was utterly brutal, particularly with young people, with leftists, with any opponents of the regime. And the question, as I dug into the facts, that loomed larger and larger, particularly after I'd spoken to Leon Gomez, having tracked him down and found him, and he told me the story, was, could it be that Walter Ralph truly was involved in the crimes of the Pinochet regime? And the reason that I was interested in that was, in a sense, it would draw a straight line between what I'd written about in the 2 earlier books. This is the 3rd in a trilogy. The first book is called East-West Street, on the origins of genocide and crimes against humanity. That's basically about the Nuremberg trial. The second one's called The Rat Line, and it's about Walter Ralph, who is the deputy to Hans Frank, who'd been Hitler's lawyer and who's one of the main characters in the first book. And if Ralph and Pinochet were involved, that would in effect mean that one of Otto Wächter's main associates was involved in a case in which I was involved, and there'd be an unbroken historical line going back. The greater concern, of course, was also that in some way, perhaps, I would learn or not that Walter Ralph had taken up the tools of his old trade from the 90s and reconfigured them to a new situation in the 1970s. And that's what took 10 years to investigate.
It was quite haunting reading some of the testimonies of these people when they're discussing Ralph and some of the actions that he had either overseen or instructed. What was it like speaking to these people about their experiences and if they recognised Ralph?
Very, very affecting. I don't know whether you've met people who have been subject to terrible torture. It marks people in ways that I've come to know. I mean, my My day job is as a barrister, and I'm often doing cases about mass murder and torture and genocide and this kind of stuff. So unfortunately, I've met a lot of people over the years who have been subjected to truly terrible things. And you learn to treat such people with the greatest respect. And you're very, very careful in how you talk about things. You take your cue from what they say. You don't want to go into a place that they don't want to talk about or that's going to trigger some reaction that is painful or difficult. So the conversations are very slow, very time consuming, and you become very attentive to tiny details. So there's one conversation that I recount in the book, and this left a really deep impression. There were rumors that Pinochet's regime, immediately after the coup, had acquired another fishing company, Pesquera Arauco. And the reason that they had acquired the fishing company was that it had a fleet of 310 refrigerated vans of the kind used to transport Leon Gomez, and that those vans may have been used to disappear people. I found the man who was the director of the fishing company until the day it was taken over by Pinochet, and then he was removed and he was arrested and he was detained and he was tortured. And he described to me how at all times when he was tortured, he had a hood over his head and his eyes were covered with a band, so he really couldn't see he never saw any person who tortured him. But he heard voices, and I asked him, did you hear any foreign voices? And he said, yes, there was Portuguese, and he said there was a German voice. And I said, German voice? He said, yes. And I said, would you recognize that German voice? And he said, absolutely, I will never forget that German voice. And at that point, I said to him, I've got a recording of a German voice. I didn't say who it was. Might I play that for you? Now, this is really delicate stuff because it's very triggering. And actually, earlier that week that I did that interview, another person who'd been in a similar position said he did not wish to hear the voice that I had on the recording because he was so anxious about what it might trigger and bring up. But this guy said, yes, I'll hear the recording. So we played the recording, and it was 2 or 3 minutes before it came to the voice that I was interested in. And at the moment the German voice came on, which was very distinctive because of its raspy character. This was someone who was a big, heavy smoker, had a very raspy, distinctive voice. At the moment that voice came up, this man's body literally froze. He clasped his hands and just stood still, looked down, and just went, and I said, do you recognize that voice? And he said, yes, I know that voice. That's the voice that I heard. I said, do you know who that person was? He says, no. I said, that was Walter Rauff. And those kinds of moments you don't forget. Interestingly, there is a theatrical play by a great Chilean writer called Ariel Dorfman called Death and the Maiden. And the entire play, it's a work of fiction, turns around the story of a woman who is blindfolded and tortured, and years later comes across the voice of the man who tortured her. It's incredibly affecting. Look, was it the voice of the person who tortured him? I've only got my own judgment. You know, this was a very honest man. Both his parents were medical doctors. He was highly educated, highly intelligent, become a businessman, prone to excess in the stories that he was telling. I was with a colleague. We both believed him 100%. There was just, to both of us, there was no shadow of a doubt that witnessing the effect on him of hearing the voice of someone who had tortured him 30 years earlier. 50 years earlier. It was 50 years ago. This interview took place in 2024, and the act of torture was in 1974. I had no doubt he was speaking with authenticity, and it's very affecting. You don't forget. You can probably hear in my voice as I tell you this story. I'm there in the room with him. You don't forget moments like that.
And I can see it in your face as well, just how powerful, moving that was for you, even reading it. I felt very moved by the way you were writing it, but understanding the level of violence within that regime. Did Pinochet and Ralph have a personal relationship?
They did. So this, life is sort of incredible. Escape plan. So he writes to Wächter, if you recall, in May 1949, don't come to the Arab world, head to South America. And he then decides to follow his own advice. He heads off first to Italy. He's on the run. He's got to be careful he doesn't get caught. Teams up with his wife and his 2 boys, and they get on a boat in Genoa in Italy, and they sail to Ecuador. And they set up a new life for themselves in the city of Quito, which is the capital of Ecuador. And he becomes a small businessman, actually, ironically, for the guy who operated the mobile gas vans across Central Europe. One of his first jobs is as a motor mechanic in the Mercedes-Benz concession, which I think is, really sort of incredible. That's in, 1950 that they arrive in Quito, Ecuador. 6 years later, 1956, Walter and his wife Edith meet an absolutely charming Chilean couple. They become very good friends. And the Chileans say to them, look, you're basically in the wrong country. You'd be better off in our country. We like people like you. Head to Chile. Take your boys into military training in Chile and move to Chile. And they do. They move in 1958. And then, as I described to you, Ralph is arrested in 1963, proceedings for extradition. He hives them off, fends them off, goes back to Punta Arenas. And for the next 10 years, he works in his king crab cannery, canning king crabs with lots of ladies who I've come to know, who were his employees. And then in 1973, on September the 11th, there is a coup d'etat. And Salvador Allende dies, and a new military junta of 4 men takes over. And the head of the military junta is Augusto Pinochet. And Ralph is thrilled beyond anything imaginable. Why? Because his mate from Quito, Ecuador, was Augusto Pinochet and his wife, Lucia. And all of a sudden, from the dreaded socialists under Allende, as Ralph writes to his sister in West Germany, I'm now like a protected monument. His friend is at the pinnacle of power in his adoptive country, and he's thrilled. And with the knowledge that they'd known each other in 1956, and subsequently, and that Ralph had come to Chile at the instigation of Pinochet's suggestions, it was not a great leap to begin to ask myself the question, did he rush north to Santiago to assist Pinochet? And the answer is, from the book, is that he did. That's a big story because it is apparently the first time that we've got evidence, hard evidence from witness testimony and others, that a former Nazi, senior Nazi, who escaped to South America, got involved in the crimes of the dictatorship in the night. So he basically picked up the tools of his trade and started again.
It shows that straight line that you were talking about earlier between earlier crimes, earlier cases to the cases in the early 90s, 2000s. But then with Pinochet on trial and being asked about these crimes, does he cooperate when he's being asked about these crimes that he's being put on trial that Ralph's involved with and he's leading?
So, of course, Pinochet never has to be asked about Ralph, and indeed he never has to be asked about the crimes, because at this point in Britain, the only issue is, can he be extradited to Spain? So his only argument is not, I didn't commit these crimes. His argument is, you can't even bring me to the court because I was president of Chile and all of these alleged crimes, which never happened while I was president of Chile, therefore I have immunity. So he doesn't have to deal with that issue. He makes one appearance in court, in the magistrate's court, in Belmarsh prison, or just by Belmarsh prison. And at that point he says, I am innocent. These are completely concocted issues. But beyond that, he never says anything at all. And so the issue of his involvement is not addressed by the English courts, beyond the English court saying there's colourable evidence, prima facie evidence of your involvement, because all of these crimes took place whilst you were head of state of Chile.
And then what's the reaction from other countries? Because you're saying this is a landmark case of a former head of state being questioned for crimes in a different country or being arrested for crimes in a different country in another country. What's the reaction in the global context?
Oh, it's just a huge sort of front page news in every country in the world, because it's never happened before. All of a sudden, every head of state is asking themselves the question, whoa, if I commit a crime under international law and I leave the office of the presidency or prime minister or king or whatever, am I at risk of being arrested when I go travelling abroad? They've never had to ask themselves that question before. So it's a huge issue. It's on the front page of every single newspaper. I remember the moment, it's like that John Lennon moment. Do you remember where you were when you heard the news that John Lennon had been killed in New York, which I do remember very well, 1980. This was a similar moment. And I was watching the football results on the afternoon of Saturday, the 17th of October in London. About 5 o'clock, the music comes on with football results. The news comes first, and they have this extraordinary news. I'm professor of international law. These are issues that I've worked on for many years, and it's never happened before. And the first item on the news is the former president of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, has been arrested today in central London, alleged with charges of crimes against humanity and genocide and mass murder. Whoa! And that was the reaction everywhere in the world. Other countries then piled in to seek his extradition: Sweden, Belgium, France. And in Chile itself, there was consternation because he's our president and he's been arrested abroad. So people are divided. There's some celebration, anti-Pinochet people in Chile and Santiago out on the streets celebrating, and others, and there's a large number of people who are in that other category, go to the British ambassador's residence or the embassy and throw eggs at the British embassy. Very, very strong reaction. And then the Chilean government's got to decide, what do we do? And at this point, the Chilean government is sort of leftist rather than rightist, so not sort of well disposed towards Pinochet, and they are in a bit of a bind. But what they ultimately decide to do is to run the argument on immunity, that he's our president, and the arrest of our former president is an indignity to our own nation, and therefore we are going to try to bring him back. Real difficulties in Spain also, because although the Spanish judge has issued the arrest warrant, Spain at that point has a right-wing government that is not unsympathetic towards Pinochet and his ilk. And of course, Spain has another problem, which is that Spain had a dictatorship of its own, from the late 1930s until the mid-1970s, run by General Franco, and there's never been any reckoning in relation to the crimes in Spain. So in many people's eyes, there is this question: how can Spain, which has never done any accountability for its own crimes, seek to do accountability for the crimes of a Chilean president? A question made all the more acute by the fact that Spain was the former colonial power for Chile. So there's a sort of, even on some people on the left, a degree of outrage that Spain, of all countries, is trying to bring Pinochet to justice when it illegally occupied Chile for centuries and has never sought to do justice for the crimes of the Franco regime. It's a simple way of saying these things are incredibly complicated.
That complexity was really, really fascinating, particularly seeing the division between the Labour government and their reaction to Pinochet and Margaret Thatcher's own response.
Well, I hadn't fully realised. I do remember at the time when I was involved in the case, Margaret Thatcher, and she had a former minister, a guy called Norman Lamont, who were huge supporters of Pinochet. They kept on going over to visit him and bringing him flowers and sympathy and stuff. And of course, what gradually emerged was that one of the reasons Pinochet felt so safe in Britain was in relation to another war, the Falklands-Malvinas War. What had transpired, and I wasn't fully aware of this, was that Chile, under Pinochet in 1982, had provided tremendous support to the British in relation to the war against Argentina. And Pinochet thought that the British would protect him. Under Thatcher, I think they would have protected him. But he arrives in London in October 1998, and in May 1997, there's been a change of government, and a Labour government has come in. And Pinochet, I would later learn, has had warnings not to travel to London, that there are these sort of leftists in government, Robin Cook, Jack Straw. Jack Straw had spent time in Chile and in the 1960s, and that he maybe wasn't safe. And Pinochet just brushed it off and said, no, she'll look after me. I'm a friend of Britain's. I gave them the use of a small airport near Punta Arenas, and I'm going. And he was shocked when he was arrested. Shocked, absolutely shocked.
I can certainly see that form of self-confidence from Pinochet as a dictator to get shocked at that. But then
he was not a humble man.
I don't think any dictator is. But then how's Chile at this point grappling with the legacy that Pinochet had left behind?
It's not. It's all been kicked into the long grass. At the point that Pinochet is arrested in 1998, there's been no cases in the Chilean courts about the crimes of the Pinochet regime, because Pinochet has passed a law in 1977, an amnesty law, creating a total amnesty in relation to any human rights violations occasioned by his regime. So it's only later, when he eventually returns, that the doors of justice creak open in Chile and a big change happens. He takes power in 1973, he loses power in 1990, he travels to the UK. In 1998, he's held in Britain for 2 years. Eventually, he goes back to Chile in March 2000. And at that point, the wheels of justice start to go round and round in Chile, and everything begins to change.
Again, that last 2 years of him in Britain is, it's fascinating to see the different political and legal complexities going off around that. But then your other character, Walter Ralph, does he ever have to face any kind of questioning for his role in any form of terror?
He doesn't. Having escaped extradition in 1963, he'd been arrested by the British in 1945 but escaped. 1963 is the extradition proceedings, but those are truncated. He goes back to Punta Arenas. Of course, the effect of his extradition proceedings is that it's been all over the newspapers, and his mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people is now known to everyone in Chile, which it wasn't before. But he never faces formal justice. I've met many of the ladies who worked in the king crab cannery at the Pesquera Camelio in Punta Arenas. And they described to me what he was like. He was a good employer, he was fair, they said, but they all knew what he had done. And I would say to them, how did it feel working with such a man who had, sent people to their deaths in these gas vans? And they said, well, there was some black humour, that if we didn't behave, he'd throw us into the steamer room for the crabs. But Philippe, they would say, we were 16, 17 years old. This was long ago in our terms, and it was far away, another world. And all we wanted was a decent job and find a husband. So we just turned a blind eye to it. But they did say the older people in the factory were very upset that he was working there. The other thing I think, that's important to say is that although he got off the hook in legal terms, he didn't get off the hook in sort of daily terms. So there were little clues about his anxieties. When Eichmann was arrested in Argentina and sent to Jerusalem and put on trial and then sentenced to death and then hanged, he got really worried. And he lived for another 20 years. He lived until 1984. And I think it's pretty clear that every day of his life, he worried about being arrested or being kidnapped or being assassinated. And he lived with that. There were interesting little clues. Every time he left the house, he would leave a note on the table in the front hall in which he would say to his wife had died by then. He was living with another lady, Nena. And he would say, I'm leaving the house at, X time. This is exactly where I'm going, and I will be back at Y time. And if I'm not back at that time, call the police. And he always went out with his dogs. He had these very vicious Alsatians who on 2 or 3 occasions actually saved him from attack, and even on one occasion from assassination. So, no, he never faced formal criminal justice. But I think every day he woke up, he worried deeply about it. And interestingly, in his correspondence, to his sister, to his nephew in West Germany, it's full of stuff about Simon Wiesenthal chasing him and worrying about what was going to happen to him. And so he didn't escape completely. He didn't wake up in the morning as you or I might. Well, I don't know about your history, but I assume you don't wake up in the morning every day worrying you're going to be kidnapped by Mossad or executed or, beaten up or whatever. He worried about that every day.
And I can imagine that fear that he'd felt would have been absolutely crippling at times, but nothing compared to the level of fear that he'd inflicted upon others. But I think, Philip, that's a nice time now to ask a final fun question, as we do for every guest who comes onto the podcast. Quite clearly, when you were writing this book, you travelled an awful lot. And I wanted to ask you, what was your favourite airport meal whilst you were doing this?
That is a fantastic question. Well, think that the airport that I would have to take you to is one of the smallest airports in the world, Punta Arenas. And I was very pleased in Punta Arenas to find on one occasion a slice of dulce de leche, which is a sort of soggy caramel cake. But the reason I was so pleased to find it was that it was Pinochet's favourite dessert. And I won't forget the rainy, windy, terrible day, flight delayed, and I'm sitting there eating dulce de leche and thinking about the day Pinochet was arrested. That's the first meal that comes to mind as you ask me your very interesting question.
I think that's a really nice answer. I think that's a really, really nice answer, actually. I love that. Thank you. And then, obviously, if people want to grab a copy of your book and any part of this trilogy, where can they go?
Well, they can go to their local independent bookstore, or they can go to Waterstones or Daunt Books, or they can get it online at Amazon or wherever. And thank you for reading it if you decide to read it. I've just got off from a long Zoom, actually, because it has already been bought to be turned into a film. And I've just spent 2.5 hours with the Chilean filmmakers talking about aspects of the script and the balance between fact and fiction, because like any decent film, they want to add some embellishments that are connected to the reality of the story. And so we've been talking about other films that we have seen that take an essentially true story but fictionalize it. I'm thinking one of my favourite films, Downfall, about the last days of Adolf Hitler, or The Lives of Others, about the East German secret police service. But it's been really nice to have this conversation with you, and looking forward to seeing you at you know where.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Great. Terrific.
Keep your heads down. Keep your heads down. Pipe down. I'm on the radio.
The We Have Ways Festival Special Series, here on History of Jackson.